Hello, everyone. This is the third session in our series where we discuss tips and tricks to approach NLSAT 2025. This session is one of the most important sessions that you need to watch for NLSAT, and this relates to time management. Because at the very core of this paper, time management is the strategy that you need to keep in mind the most. Even if you're not good with many other things in this exam, if your time management is good enough, you're already way ahead in your preparation than other candidates. So that's why this session is very, very crucial and in some ways will lay the foundation of your entire preparation. So before I get into the thick of the things, let me just give you some preface to how time management helps you in this exam and why it's one of the most important things. Because the general difficulty level of this paper is not that much. You'll be able to go through different parts of it, be the logical reasoning section or even the part B. The difficulty that majority of the students face is to time themselves because you only have about 2.5 hours and you need to attempt an entire uh, MCQ based paper, and then you also need to attempt a subjective based component of this paper. So to be able to manage your time between both of these components is no easy task. So this session is specifically about managing your time in part A, and then in some later session, we'll discuss how you can manage your time in part B as well. But in this session, what we'll be specifically looking towards is one, how can you save up more of your time as you're attempting part A? And second, what are some things you need to avoid that generally take away a lot of your time or which end up making you waste a lot of your time? So all of those things we'll keep in mind. And as we are preparing, we'll need to keep away from them. And then additionally, some tips and tricks that you need to keep in mind. Let's start with the basics because the first thing that a lot of students ask is what is an ideal time to finish this paper in, especially if we are speaking of part A. Now, let's keep a very standard benchmark, which we can use for all mocks that you are going to attempt. And you'll also have to accordingly set up that benchmark for your exam as well. Generally, a good time to finish a part A is within 60 minutes, and you can take plus minus 5 minutes. Maybe if you're a little slow with reading and if you're just catching up to the pace of this exam, if imagine you are watching this video somewhere close to the exam, let's say only 1 month is left or 2 weeks are left, then maybe it might take you a little more time and you don't have enough time to reduce your overall time to attend part A. But generally, keep your benchmark around 60 minutes. That's the amount of time you should ideally take to finish a part A. But with that, it's also equally important to now recognize that part A in this paper has become more important than part B. Because if you do not manage to score enough in your part A, your part B is anyway not going to be evaluated. So it's more or less insignificant that if you try to end up, or if you try to finish your part A within such a short span of time, in order to make up some time for your part B, that your accuracy is lost out in that process. So it's a very fine balance you have to strike, which is that you have to ensure that as you're attempting your part A, you're only taking as minimum time as possible, yet at the same time, your accuracy shouldn't suffer because of that. So for me, and through experience and based on various students we have mentored over the years, we have realized that about 60 minutes, and as I said, plus minus 5 minutes is what ideally candidates take to finish their part A. So that gives you about 1.5 hours for part B, which is, I believe, more than enough for you to write elaborate and descriptive answers in part B. Now, how do you then go about using these 60 minutes to finish your part A? The first thing to keep in mind, and this is if you are just starting or if you're attempting any competitive exam for the first time, and if you don't have any experience with attempting a competitive exam, you should always have some timestamps to evaluate or assess how well you have done time-wise as you're attempting the paper. So let's say you want to finish 20 questions within, let's say, uh, 10 minutes. So if there are a total of 75 questions, you divide your paper, let's say, into 3 different parts. That I want to finish my first 25 questions in 20 minutes. Next 25 questions in 20 minutes. Now, it's a very subjective thing. Different people might prefer different range of timestamps. So I personally prefer that by the time half of my time is done, let's say 30 minutes, I should have ideally at least attempted 35 to 40 questions. So do have those timestamps, which give you a reality check as you're attempting your paper of how much time has gone through or how much time have you spent on different parts of the paper. Many times students don't keep these timestamps. They'll only see that if clock has hit 60 minutes and if I finished 75 questions. Because if you do not keep this mini timestamps, you might realize that you've already maybe spent too much time on your part A and you don't have enough time left. So having those timestamps keeps giving you reality check that I've spent, let's say, 10 minutes and I've only attempted 15 questions. I need to pace myself up. I need to expedite my answering approach. So all of that needs to be kept in mind as you are going through your timestamp process, as you are trying to keep a tab of time in the exam. Third thing, and this is a very basic advice, is that since there is a net negative marking in this exam, what that means is that even if you don't attempt a question, you'll still get a negative mark for that, or you'll face a deduction for that. So do not overthink too much, especially when you feel that you know an option is correct, but there might be some secondary doubts in your mind and you're not fully sure about it. I would suggest that not to get bogged down by such a question and just generally attempt it, and do not waste too much of your time on that question. Because if in worst case you do get it wrong, the other outcome, which was that if you had not attempted it at all because you were thinking too much about it, you would have still gotten a negative mark. So there is a good chance that if you trust your intuition and you trust yourself and attempt it, you might just get it right. So do not overthink too much in part A. That does take up a lot of time for candidates. Now, the other advice, and this goes into the second or the third slide that I wanted to show, is time subsidization. So this is a very simple and effective tool. This is effectively a part of knowing when a question needs to be skipped. So every exam has a certain format. If there are about 75 questions in your part A in NLSAT, of those 75 questions, not all of them will be of same difficulty level. Let's say about 30 to 40 questions will be somewhere on the easier side of the scale. So 30 questions, not too difficult. If you look at the question, if you look at the options, usually the answer will click in your mind in, let's say, about 10 to 15 seconds. So those are your easy questions. Then there are about 20, 25 odd questions, which you can say somewhere on the medium side, which are slightly or on a moderate side of the scale. And then whatever is left, about 10 or 15 questions, will be on the difficult side. So this is how any exam is structured. You have a fair balance of easy, moderate, and difficult questions. Now, for a candidate, although many of you may be familiar with this, that of course, no exam has all the questions difficult, or no exam has all the questions on the easier side. But to know that certain parts of the exam can get you much better marks than other parts, because all these easy, difficult, and moderate questions are jumbled together. It's not like they're segregated, that the first 40 questions will be the easy ones. So what happens to a lot of times, many times to candidates, is that let's say they start attempting their paper, and let's say the first 5 questions they see in the first passage itself turn out to be very difficult. And that certainly demotivates them, because they might not know the answer to those questions, and that slows down their pace as well. So if you're somebody who's timing yourself and you look at the clock, in the first 5 questions itself, you have taken up, let's say, 10 minutes. That can hit your confidence very hard, because you might not have realized as you're trying to attempt those questions because they were on the difficult side, but you end up wasting a lot of those time. What to do in such a situation? Because these are the points where people lose most of their time subconsciously. Most of the times this happens. What you need to do in such a situation is that, one, if you feel a question is not, or the answer is not clicking in your mind on the first go or even on the second go, and that you have really thought about it and it's still not coming to your mind as to what the answer can be, my suggestion is that you skip that question. Give it another attempt once you have gone through other questions. Because what our objective in this paper is that to first make sure that we attempt all the questions that we find the easiest. So if I find, let's say, questions about, as I mentioned, 30, 40 odd questions that are on the easier side, my objective is to make sure that the questions that are easiest to attempt, that do not take too much of my time, and that allow me to skip through paper as quickly as possible, those are my first priority. Those are the questions I want to first go through. So that's something you should do in your own exam strategy as well. That if you find any question too difficult and if it's taking too much of your time, you should skip it, move to the next question. Maybe the other question is a lot easier than the one that you just skipped, and it allows you to first certainly get some marks, but it also gives you a confidence boost. Because if you're stuck over a difficult question and you're not able to find an answer, not only do you lose a mark because you're not able to attempt it, but you also lose your time, which also builds up some stress to attempt an easy question. So if you understand, this is like a deck of cards falling on you, that because of one difficult question, you ended up wasting too much of your time. That also affects your easy questions also, because now you're limited on time because you took too much time in the previous question. So even an easy question, and sometimes uh, if you do your post mock analysis, you will realize that many easy questions that you felt afterwards you could have easily attempted, you were not able to attempt them in the paper. And the reason it happens is because at the time when you're attempting that question, you're already under too much pressure. you're feeling that pressure on your head, you feel you have very little time, and even a seemingly easy question becomes very difficult. So that's the reason why you should take this approach of skipping a question if you feel it's too difficult for you, and if you feel that uh, it might be more useful to revisit this question towards the end of my paper rather than get stuck over that question. This is what effectively we call time subsidization as well, which is that not all questions deserve equal amount of time. Make sure that you are able to save up as much time as possible on the easier questions. And how easy a question is sometimes it's just not about actually the question itself, but also how much time you have. If your mind is relaxed, it's calm, and you are able to think freely, the question is much easier to attempt. But if you have time pressure building on you, then you can very easily get that easy question wrong as well. So that's why what our, or I would say the optimum strategy in an exam like an LSAT is that to ensure that for all the easy questions, you take up as little time as possible, and then you will certainly save up some time. Because if I can attempt a easy question in say 10 seconds or 15 seconds, that saves me up some time for other questions that I felt were more difficult. So then towards the end of my exam, let's say I have attempted about 60 questions now in let's say 40 minutes, and I only have 15 questions left and 20 minutes. Now I can revisit all those difficult questions that I was not able to attempt on my first go. How does it help you? It helps you in two ways. One, दिमाग से stress हट जाता है. There is no stress on your mind now, because now you know you have done all the 60 questions, and you also feel confident about doing those 60 questions because you know that majority of them were right, and you were able to attempt them with having enough time on your hands. So then it gives you a confidence and allows you to then easily go through all the difficult questions. And you also have some estimate of how much time is left with you. The opposite of it is when, let's say, a difficult question shows up somewhere around, let's say, question number 15 is very difficult and question number 16 is also very difficult. And then you get stuck up on that for, let's say, 5 minutes. That entirely derails your strategy. Then you don't know in how much time you should attempt the rest of the paper. So to avoid that very problem, you should make sure that first you go through all the questions that you find easy in the exam. Then you go through all the moderate questions that you think might take a little bit of thinking to attempt. Because as I said, pick up the fruits which are easiest to pick first, right? Like if there's a tree and you're standing under the tree and there are fruits which are fallen on the ground, you'll obviously first pick all those fruits which are fallen on the ground because they're easiest to pick. And then you, if the fruits which are still left on the tree, which are hanging by the tree, then you'll go for them. So that's something you should do in an exam as well. Pick up the easy points first, then go for the difficult ones. Gives you a much better perspective as well in the exam. So this is all there is to time subsidization. And as you're giving your mock tests, try to inculcate this as a strategy, because most candidates, although they realize this advice, most of you might think that it's a very obvious thing to say that do easy questions first and then the difficult ones. But most people do not really inculcate this when they are doing their mock test and when they are giving the actual exam as well. Now, this is advice again for your, as you're giving your mock test and as you're preparing, which is having a little bit of self-awareness. One, always keep in mind what really is eating up a lot of your time. I'll tell you some general illustrations where I've seen a lot of students take up their time. First is they overthink too much. That's one of the reasons. So they might know the answer and they're sure about that answer as well, but they're just not confident enough to tick on that answer. So they end up, let's say, ideally, if they had thought of the answer in first 10 seconds, they actually end up ticking on that answer in next 30-40 seconds more. The reason that happens is because they're too unsure in their own mind if that's really the right answer. My very honest suggestion is that if you feel on the first go something is the right, or in your mind that's the right answer, tick on it. In majority of the instances, that will be the right answer for you as well, because there must have been a good reason for you to even come to that conclusion. If you're overthinking, that's certainly not going to make a wrong answer the right one, because even if you think for additional 1 minute, it's not likely to change your answer too much. In fact, it affects your strategy in the long run, because for every question you will overthink too much. Second reason is again underthinking as well. This doesn't happen as often, but sometimes students in a hurry, or maybe if they feel the exam is too easy, and if they're going through each and every question very easily, they feel that this is too easy for me, so they don't put any thought into it. So make sure that while you certainly take some time to think of the answer, do not just uh, underthink as well, okay? You need to also see what kind of questions take up a lot of your time. For some students, maybe GK is that reason. For some students, it could be English, it could be logical reasoning. Within logical reasoning, there can be certain types of question which take up their time. So when we say time management, there is no blanket term to understand that there is one single reason which causes everyone to waste the time or which causes people to take more time. For everyone, there are different reasons as to what contributes to them taking more time than the ideal limit. So please, when you're doing your mocks, always think a little bit about what are the different questions which have taken too much of your time. And sometimes you will see a pattern emerging that these are the certain types of question where I've taken too much of my time. Maybe it could be GK and it could be some other section of the exam as well. Sometimes people also take too much time if they're not able to understand a question or if they're confused between the options. Those can be other reasons as well. The point is there can be many, many reasons. It's that you need to identify what are those reasons and only then you can work upon that. Let's move on to the next one. This thing is, the next one is how do you deal about with the tricky options, which is that if let's say you are in the exam, this comes across as a very significant problem when students are going through their paper and questions, they end up having some very tricky options in between. First is that you need to sharpen up your elimination technique. So in a short while, we'll also take a session for you on how you go about doing elimination technique. So that certainly helps a lot because students sometimes take too much of time, not for any other reason, but simply because they're confused between the options. Although the options are not so close, but under the pressure of the time, students end up thinking the options are a lot more closer than they actually are. So in that scenario, elimination technique, a very simple tried and tested method for competitive exams, is very useful. And for many students, it has been quite useful. Second is certainly as you practice, and that's why having some sort of mock test series that you're enrolled with is very important, because the more you practice, the better your intuition gets. The more you get in tune with what the exam is about and what sort of strategy you need for the exam. So more and more practice gives you a certain kind of, I would say, intuition, which helps you deal with all sorts of questions that can come about. So these are some strategies that you need to take in mind for time management in this exam. I have shared with you some strategies which will come about when you do some self-reflection, when you think of what have or what reasons have been for which you have not taken or for which you have exceeded your time limit, coupled with the fact that there are some do's and don'ts as well, which you need to avoid. For instance, overthinking or just taking too much of your time reading a certain passage. These are the reasons which contribute too much. And then accordingly, what are some new strategies you need to keep in mind? For instance, be the time subsidization or skipping over questions. These are also equally useful for time management at this exam. So this is all for this session. Thank you all for watching this.